Conference. Anyone going to G3 this year? We got some folks G3. All right. G3 is the becoming one of the major annual conferences. It's in Atlanta, and it's the 19th and 20th of January in Atlanta. It has been at the Praise Mill Baptist Church up until now. This year they're going big time, and we'll be at the Convention Center. And the speaker list is too long for me to even have memorized, but I know that Paul Washer will be there, and Phil Johnson will be there, and D.A. Carson will be there, and I'm not sure if Conrad Mbewe is going to be there or not. Bodie Balcom will be there, and I'll be there. That's sort of one of the lowlights, but what we're going to do this year is to kick the conference off on the Wednesday night before. We are going to be doing a debate, and it'll be the first time, I think, since 1996 that Catholic Answers has been willing to debate me. And so I'll be debating staff apologist Trent Horn on whether you can lose your salvation. He absolutely demanded that was the only subject to do. Not my favorite subject because there's so many foundational issues to it, but we decided it was best to do something than nothing, and so it obviously is relevant to the Reformation issues and things like that. So that'll be January 18th in Atlanta. So if you're heading that direction, or if you were sort of on the bubble as to whether you were going to go or not, there's that may keep you away. Who knows? It's like, well, now I know you're going to be there and you'll be debating that. I'm not staying a long ways. I don't know, you know. So on the screen, let me actually make this improve this a little bit for everybody. There you go. A little bit easier to see. In fact, let's do it. That's Grandpa says. That's right. That's what I wish you could do that with the text, but it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and heavier when you do it. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 9. But we do see him who is made for a little while lower than the angels, namely Jesus, because of the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, so by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Now, this is a very important section. It's talking about the necessity of the incarnation. It's talking about it was fitting for him. It goes on to quote from a number of passages from the Greek Septuagint, again relevant to the incarnation and the giving of his life in behalf of his brethren, and it really sort of is important in laying the foundation for the connectedness between the fact that Jesus had to be a true human being to give his life as a sacrifice for sins and things like that. So it's an important theological section. But I don't even think that the text here necessarily, the NASB notes does not say anything about this. But if you look at the Greek text of Hebrews 2:9, right here there is a little mark at the beginning of, this is karati theou, which is by the grace of God. You've heard of the term charismatic. Charis means a gift or grace. And so there is charis, by the grace of God, in behalf of all to taste death. But there's a little thing there, and when you click on it, the notes come up, and the notes are very small. Make them a little bit larger. There is a textual variant at Hebrews 2:9. Now, it is considered by the vast majority of scholarship to be a very minor textual variant. And it is interesting that on a just the level of the book itself, the book of Hebrews has fewer textual variants than almost any other book in the New Testament. It has a very, very pure transmission history to it, which is interesting. But if you can see up there, and I Yeah, I know right where it is, so I can actually run down there and get it, even though it's hiding in the dark. Yes. See, some people know me all too well already, and they know that I'm looking for my super laser. Unfortunately, looks like my, oh boy, it'd be really a bummer if my super laser fell out. Oh, good, and the battery's good too, that's good. If you can see up here, there is a minor textual variant right there. It says chorus theou. Instead of karati theou, it says chorus. Now chorus is a Greek word that means apart from, without. And so you see next to it 0243, and then 1739 with an asterisk next to it. And then VGMS means Vulgate manuscripts. ORMSS means more manuscripts from Origen. AMBR is Ambrosiaster. HIER manuscripts means manuscripts from Jerome. And then FUG is Fulgentius. These are abbreviations for early church writers. Now again, this is considered a minor variant. Why? Well, because the vast majority of biblical manuscripts of the book of Hebrews, however many they might be, we have 5,717 cataloged manuscripts of the New Testament, but that doesn't mean they all contain the entirety of the New Testament. So for the book of Hebrews, we might have 500, 600 along those lines, maybe 1,000. I honestly don't know the total number. But this is a small number of manuscripts that have a very interesting reading. Now, you can see that chorus and karati look a lot alike in the original language. But what would it mean that apart from God, he might taste death in behalf of all people? Apart from God. Well, Bart Ehrman has made a big deal out of this particular text. And again, I think one of the reasons he does so is the vast majority of, honestly, even solid exegetes, solid pastors working through the book of Hebrews. If you were preaching through the book of Hebrews, unless you really have an eye to the critical text, unless you're really looking at the notes and you're following the textual data, this isn't even going to pop up. And I did notice that's the Nestle-Aland text, so it has it. It has the variant. But if you, does anyone have, how many, okay, let me see how many geeks there are in the audience. How many of you have a Greek New Testament with you this evening? Is it on your phone? It's all okay, how many of you have a paper Greek New Testament? Okay, so which, Nestle-Aland? Yeah, at home, okay, well, all right. Anybody else? Okay, not too many super geeks, or are you just, the rest of you are just being humble, I understand. That's fully understandable because you're afraid I might ask you a question. That's what it really is. But if you had the United Bible Society's text, which is very frequently used as a beginning introductory text, there will be no reference to a variant here. They only give about 450 variants in the New Testament, and they only give the variants that would have a material impact upon the translation. Now that would have a material impact upon the translation, but it just simply doesn't rank as having sufficient textual data behind it to appear in the United Bible Society text. So if you were using UBS text, even if you were trying to do due diligence as a pastor and notice these things, you wouldn't even recognize that it was there. And unfortunately, a large, well, I'd say 95% of the commentaries in the book of Hebrews won't mention it either. Maybe it's buried in a footnote at the end of the chapter someplace. There might be something, but in all probability, something like this just won't be noted. This is called Accordance Bible Software. Years ago, I used BibleWorks, and it was in that time period when you either were Windows or you were Mac. And when Windows drove me out of that platform with something called Vista, which was demonically inspired and written, and I came to the light and embraced the Mac cult. There were only certain possibilities. Logos had already gone both directions. You could have Windows or Mac, but just barely. And Accordance was only going to be in the Mac format, and so I had to do the rather expensive switching over, which they actually helped me do. The guys at Accordance were very, very nice to me along those lines. Now, of course, they're all dual platform. BibleWorks is available both for Mac and Windows, and Accordance is available for Windows, and blah, 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 and all the rest of the stuff. But once you've invested the amount of money that I've invested, then you're pretty much stuck with what you've got at that particular point in time. But yes, the textual data is available now. I mean, I don't have my phone up here, but my phone now has a textual database on it that would rival anything that was available only 60, 70 years ago in any seminary. It's amazing the availability of the information now on any platform. How many people actually utilize it, or it's one thing to have it up there. It's another thing to realize that, oh, H-I-E-R means Jerome. Yeah, that's easy to figure out. It is if you read Latin, because that's what his name would come across in Latin. But anyway, that's where the information comes from there. Now, that kind of variant is there. No one's hiding it. I do not believe that it is would I necessarily mention this while preaching Hebrews 2:9? It would depend on the context. I probably did. I haven't gone back and listened to I don't know, I think it was 80 sermons I did through Hebrews. I haven't gone back and listened. I probably mentioned it briefly. My people expect me to do things like that, and I've laid a foundation of trust with them to be able to do that. If you haven't laid that type of foundation, if you're a pastor or something like that, please don't think that what I'm telling you to do is to go back on Sunday and start mentioning all the textual variants in whatever text you're preaching. That will cause a general rebellion, and probably church splits and all sorts of really nasty stuff like that. But it's obviously something that has to be done over time. But there would be other contexts in which I would not mention it. If I were preaching outside of my own church and my emphasis was specifically on the theology of Hebrews chapter 2 in regards to the subject of atonement and the intention and scope of the atonement, yeah, I probably would not take the time to discuss it. But there are contexts in which it is relevant to do so. And the number of variants like this is very large. There are a number of variants like this. But this one, you look at it and, okay, 1739 is actually an important manuscript. That probably reflects the earliest. I mean, 1739 itself is from around the 10th century, but we can tell it's a copy of like a very early 3rd century manuscript itself. And Origen knew of manuscripts in his day that had that reading, as did Jerome. And Origen and Jerome, why are they important? Well, I'll tell you. Fascinatingly enough, there are really only 2 of the early church writers who knew both Greek and Hebrew, Origen and Jerome. Pretty much everybody else was only functioning with one language, very rarely with Hebrew at all. And many, like Augustine, certainly didn't have any Hebrew, and his Greek wasn't overly good either. So that impacts a lot of things when it comes to the theology as well. So it's there. Some people will try to blow up its significance, and the reason they do so is because they know that there is a level of discomfort due to lack of exposure to the realities of how manuscripts were transmitted. Let me show you something about how manuscripts were transmitted. Accordance can do this. I can pull things up, but this is a little bit prettier. This is a page from P P45. Now, if you're a World War II buff like I am, you get really confused between papyri and fighters. There were some great, you know, the P38 and all sorts of stuff like that. The Mustang will never. Is there anything more beautiful than a fully restored Mustang from World War II? Oh, those are incredible planes. A little bit faster than what we are in today, Ken. Not much. No, only you know, about 500 miles per hour instead of 120. So yeah, a few more G's when you do the turns. But the papyri are actually, believe it or not, more exciting to me than the World War II fighter planes are, and I'm one of the weird people along those lines. And this one in particular, P45, is an extremely unusual manuscript, not because of the way it happens to look there. It's made out of papyrus, which is why it's called P45. And papyrus, you know, it's made of taking the leaves of a papyrus plant, putting them at 90-degree angles, pressing them together. Normally produces one side that's rather smooth, one side that's rather rough. For some reason, Christians, we don't know why, always preferred to write on both sides and to write in books rather than scrolls. Scrolls were extremely popular in the first century. But for some reason, we've only found like half a dozen Christian scrolls. Christians just didn't do scrolls. Was it because of the synagogue thing? And I don't know. I don't know. But they preferred the codex form, so much so that some people credit the Christians with popularizing the form of book that we have today, where you have bound together in pages that turn and so on and so forth. And P45, we know, was originally around 220 pages long. It's written somewhere between 180 and 220 AD. So it's right at the end of the 2nd century, the beginning of the 3rd century. And it contained, and this is what's there's a couple things unusual about it, it contained Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Acts. That's unusual. We have a number of manuscripts like P66 and P75 that had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but Acts, poor Acts, it may have been authored by Luke and originally was with Luke, but it got cut off and sent off to the, it just had a lonely life, shall we say, textually speaking. And so it's unusual to find a manuscript that has those books together. And what you're looking at, I wish I could, I actually can. Actually, I can do it. I can do it. We have the technology. It won't cost $6 million either. Some of you don't know what that was about, but that's okay. You prefer what? The Bionic Woman, yeah. Okay, this is probably the same image. Let's see. Yeah, it is. Okay, there's the same image. But now what I can do, uh-oh. It froze, didn't it? It's just a little behind us. It's a time warp thing. There we go. Oh. So verily and forsooth, we were... So I was in this debate once in a mosque, and the overhead would probably be very interesting, though I don't think it would really help me to do this a whole lot. So he says from the back of the audience, standing right next to the Apple TV thing, watch what I can do with this here. Now you see right here, is that moving up there? Can you see? Okay, good. See that line right there? That is the indication of what's called a nomina sacra. Now, if you want to get any of the donuts that someone has promised me tomorrow morning, you have to be able to use the special password nomina sacra. You think I'm kidding, don't you? I am not kidding. Nomina Sacra will be the password for all the donuts in the morning. And there we go. Yes, yes, yes. I will steal all of Ken's pictures later. For some reason, and we do not know why, Christians developed an abbreviation system when copying their manuscripts. So God, Lord, Jesus, Father, Spirit, the sacred names, for some reason they used either a 2 or 3 letter abbreviation with a line over top. It's one of the easiest ways to identify Christian manuscripts, is that for some reason that's what they did. And it's not completely consistent. Like I said, some manuscripts will use a 3 letter, some a 2 letter. Sometimes there'll be different letters. We do not know why they did it. I mean, I initially theorized, well, you know, they're saving space. No, that's not it. We don't know why they did it. But there you have one. There you have one of the Nomina Sacra. This is from the Gospel of John, chapter 10. And you can actually even see a textual variant. Can you see the textual variant? Right here. See how above the line, that's been scratched out in a different reading by the same scribe, evidently, has been written up above it. Now, why do I show you this? Well, if you have never seen the Greek language before, it may not mean anything to you. But keep that in mind. Hello? There we go. Whew. It's going. It's frozen on me. Compare what I was showing you before in accordance. Notice this over here. The Greek there, you'll notice there are, well, you can't really, well, you can. There are capital letters, and then there are smaller letters, and there are spaces between words, just like we have in English. Greek reads in the same direction that we read as English. Hebrew, the opposite direction. This is called minuscule text, where you have space between words, use large letters and small letters. Did you notice something about that manuscript? There weren't any differentiations between the letters. Instead, what you had for the first 800 years of the transmission of the text of the New Testament, all capital letters, no spaces between words, and almost no punctuation whatsoever. All capital letters, no space between words, and almost no punctuation at all. And that's certainly the case of all the papyri. All the papyri. Now think about what it's like to copy something like that. Take your favorite book and put it into all capital letters and take all the spaces out between words. And then start copying it. How demanding is that upon the mind? You're having to try to follow that line of capital letters and to make sense out of what's there. And unfortunately, some scribes actually couldn't read the language they were copying. They're just copying symbols. It's really easy to make a mistake or something like that in a context like that. But it's also really easy to make a mistake where something is, well, yeah, I've got just enough time to show you one of these, and that is the concept of homoi teleuton, which will be the password for the coffee. So we have we have Nomina Sacra. Now that one's going to be more important to a lot of you. Actually, I know some of you are just addicted to that stuff, and I can't stand the taste of coffee. I'm sorry. I wish I could. My daughter worked for Starbucks, and so it would have been wonderful and great and awesome if I could have developed a taste for coffee, but I don't understand it. But those of you who are addicts, I understand. It's okay. I'm not upset with you. I feel for you, but I'm not upset with you. Let me show you. Converting two movies, really, seriously. You couldn't have converted them before? Okay, yes. And I knew you couldn't do it anyways, so it was a failure all the way along. Here it is. Here it is. And boom. Here is 1 John 3:1. 1 John 3:1. 1 John 3:1. And some of you may have memorized 1 John 3:1. It's a beautiful passage. Behold, what kind or how great a love the Father has granted or given to us, in order that we might be called the children of God, and we are. For this reason the world is not knowing us, because it did not know him. Okay, but if you memorize that in the King James, there was something added there. Because the King James does not have the phrase, and we are. So the King James just simply has that we might be called the children of God. For this reason the world does not know us, because it did not know him. And that entire phrase, and we are, is not in the King James or the New King James Version of the Bible, but it's in your ESV and your New American Standard, your NIV, so on and so forth. Why? Well, it's because the Greek manuscripts that are being translated. Here from, this is actually Logos software that I took this from years and years and years ago. There's a little square next to and we are, Kai Esman. And you're given the information that it's deleted by these manuscripts. And in fact, you see that funny looking M right there? That's called a Fraktur M. Fraktur is a fancy German font, old German font. And it is used for some odd reason in Greek New Testaments to represent what's called the majority text. The majority of Greek manuscripts of 1 John do not contain that phrase. We'll see later on, the majority of those come from well after 1,000 years after Christ, and that's relevant. But that's the information. But that doesn't explain why it happened. Let's take a look at why it happened. Here is what that line would have looked like as a line of capital letters. Let me use color to show you where the issue is. And then I think the next one blows it up. Nope, it doesn't. So right there. We'll just have to go with that. Tekna theou, that's a nomina sacra, kleithomen, we might be called. Kai esmen, and we are. For this reason the world does not know us, so on and so forth. Notice that they're the exact same three letters. They're ending two different words. Now, this used to be easier to explain. This actually works better for those of you over 40 in the room than for those of you under. Because those of you over 40 have done something called writing a term paper on a typewriter. Yes. Now, I had an IBM Selectric. I was blessed. Some of you are old enough that you didn't even have stuff like that. But yes, you younger people, one of the reasons you are to respect your elders is because we wrote term papers on typewriters with whiteout, correction tape, forgetting to put our footnotes in, so you have to take the entire piece of paper out, crumble it up, throw it away, and start all over again. Yes, we did that while fighting off the dinosaurs at the same time. That's why you need to respect us, okay? And that's why we demand that respect, and you better keep that in mind. We had to copy out of books. I remember the first time I ever learned the commands for copy and paste. Oh, what a wonderful thing that is. Now, unfortunately, what that does, copy and paste, allows us to reproduce ignorance faster than any generation before us. Facebook is evidence of that. But there's a great advantage. Because it used to be, remember how fun it was, especially when you had a big book you had to copy out of, how did you keep it open to the right page? We would have all these gadgets and stuff that would prop the book open and weights to put on certain parts of the page, and oh, it was just so much. And you'd break the bindings of books trying to make them lie flat so you could copy out of them. But the whole point was, there you're sitting and you're typing away, and you're having to go back and forth, back and forth. That's about as close as we can get to what the scribes were having to do back then. And what happens is, let's say I'm typing a line that has the word education in it. And so I type education, T-I-O-N. I just get done typing T-I-O-N. My eye goes back to the book, and I find T-I-O-N, and I continue on. The problem is that T-I-O-N is on the next line down, at the end of a different word, and I don't notice it. Now, hopefully I'll proofread, right? Hopefully I'll proofread and catch it. Most of the time I will not. And generally, by the time you get done with the quote, it's too late one way or the other. If you catch it, you have to start the whole page all over again if you were typing anyways. But I have now deleted an entire line of text. Why? Because of what's called homoteleuton, similar endings. It is a natural activity of the human mind in the copying process, that your mind's going to go back, you find the letter, the group of letters you just got done typing, and you continue on. Most of the time you'll get it right, but sometimes it's on the line below. Sometimes, if you're really not paying attention, it's on the line above. And then you get to repeat yourself. That's called ditography. It happened. But there are many variants in the New Testament that we can identify as coming from sites of errors of sight and errors of hearing. Because sometimes you weren't copying a manuscript by looking at it. Sometimes you're in what's called a scriptorium, and someone was reading the manuscript, so you could have multiple scribes, and you could make more copies that way. The problem is that then introduces the issue of errors of hearing. So these are there. Now that's one of the reasons why we have such great confidence that we know what the original of 1 John 3:1 was. Because we can see exactly why "and we are" would get deleted, homoteleuton. We can't see any reason why it would just all of a sudden get inserted out of nowhere. Because the early scribes, with a very few exceptions, and they're glaring and easily identified, the early scribes were just trying to copy the text. And they're trying to be as faithful as they possibly could be. Even Bart Ehrman makes that point, that the vast majority of the scribes were just trying to do a good job in copying the text. And so the idea of just, hey, let's throw a whole phrase in here for no good reason, when we can see a very good reason why it would have been skipped over by natural causes, homoteleuton, greatly increases our confidence. Now, of course, we're also very thankful we have more than one manuscript of 1 John. If we only had one manuscript of 1 John, then we'd have a problem, because we'd have no way of comparing. That's why having as many manuscripts as we do is a very, very good thing. We'll get into all of these things once we sort of lay the foundation of looking at some of these variants and understanding what's actually there. Now, I've thrown a bunch of stuff at you, and we haven't even gotten to the good stuff. And what I mean by the good stuff is, the reality is that we have an embarrassment of riches in manuscript evidence for the New Testament, far more than any other work of antiquity. Anybody working with any other work of antiquity looks at those of us that work with the New Testament and just sort of goes, yeah, it's really rough being you. Because most of the time they only have manuscripts from 500 to 900 years after their originals were originally written. They'll have 7 to 20 manuscripts. We have 5,717. They'll have maybe a few translations in other languages. We have over 20,000 manuscripts in other languages. And so our problem is the massive amount of information and handling all of that. Their problem is the opposite and much more dangerous problem, and that is a lack of information. We have a lot of information, as we will point out tomorrow. But the point is this. We have a text that has come down to us through time. The question is going to be, in light of the reality of its history, how did God preserve it? I'm going to tell you right now, I believe the New Testament has been supernaturally preserved. But I can tell you about all of these things. The problem is, one of the things we're going to have to talk about is that I have brothers and sisters, some others that I'm not so sure about, Many who will not identify me as a brother or sister at all. You all know that Jack Chick died recently, right? Remember Jack Chick? How many of you know who Jack Chick was? How many of you do not know who Jack Chick was? How many you folks never saw those cartoon tracks like This Was Your Life and Holy Joe? And that was Jack Chick, man. All the Alberto comics and all that kind of stuff, man, that all came from Jack Chick. And I got sent to the principal's office in 4th grade for passing out Jack Chick tracks on the playground. It was great. So I walked up to the principal and gave him one too. So I'll never forget that. But irony of all ironies, once I grow up and I write a certain book on the King James only controversy, Jack Chick decides that I'm the Antichrist. So I've had an interesting life. But those folks in that camp don't believe I'm a Christian. I'm actually using holograms to hide the horns on my head. But some of my brethren in that camp and in other camps are very, very intent upon convincing you that there are certain theories of preservation that you need to accept on a theological basis that require you to pretty much ignore these textual variants and to embrace a perspective of the text that's going to say, this is the standard, we arrive at it theologically, and if you look at variants and if you attempt to defend the overall veracity of the New Testament manuscript tradition as a whole, you are compromising the Bible. You're compromising the Bible. And for those of you who are a part of the broadly Reformed tradition, there is I don't know that it's growing, but I just think the internet sort of makes it look like it at times, but there are a number of people who are promoting something called the ecclesiastical text position, which is the idea that the church has determined the text. Now, problem with that is when I keep asking, could you identify it? They can't do that part. But it sounds really good to say, we don't want all your unbelieving textual critical scholarship, as if it's unbelieving to recognize textual variants and deal with them. We don't want all that. We have this theological foundation. The problem is any text that exists, any translation that's ever existed, the King James Version of the Bible was based upon certain people doing textual criticism of manuscripts. You may want to ignore it. You may not want to know who they were, because especially when it comes to the King James, they weren't Protestants. The primary text upon which the King James is based is called the Textus Receptus, and it goes back to the 5 editions of a man by the name of Desiderius Erasmus. And Desiderius Erasmus was a Roman Catholic priest. Now, he was a great critic of the corruption of Rome in his day. I love Erasmus. Erasmus was a great guy. He also wrote in defense of transubstantiation. Let's not forget these historical facts. But there's all sorts of movements out there. And if we don't have a foundation in an understanding of where the New Testament came from and its history, we have no way of responding to these movements. We have no way of even beginning to interact with them in a meaningful fashion. And that's not a good thing. Now, really quickly, when you ask questions, please make sure it's a question. That's always a good element of questions. That means it has a squiggly thing at the end, and it normally terminates within 30 seconds of when it started. I may say to you, we'll get to that tomorrow. Or I may give you a really brief answer and say, we'll get to that tomorrow. Or I may say to you, talk with Pastor Van, because that's how I get rid of all the questions I really don't want to answer anyways. So, because I get to get on a plane on Sunday, he doesn't. So that's the easy way around everything, right? And I've done that to you for years. And when I first came, you had hair. Now look at you. So that's what happens. So, anyways, so let's go ahead and take some questions. Yes, sir. Right. The question is, we can sort of come up with an average number of pages in the manuscripts that we have cataloged. And obviously that reflects the later manuscripts where you have entire New Testaments and things like that, around 200 pages. When it comes to secular manuscripts, it would all depend on what you've got. I mean, if you're looking at Tacitus, then Tacitus has a certain number of pages. If you're looking at a poetic work that might be much shorter, that's going to totally change that. So I've never heard of any type of average, because you're dealing with them. At least in the New Testament, we know how long the New Testament is, so we can sort of get an average. But when it comes to other works, since they're all different lengths, I've never heard of anyone averaging them out. So no. Yes, sir.
Is that the new MacBook Pro with the touch bar?
No. This is just the little MacBook. It's the current MacBook, the 12-inch MacBook. My brand new MacBook Pro with a 2 terabyte SSD drive with the touch bar is still at home because I'm building it from the ground. I'm doing a full fresh install on it. It would be my 5th MacBook Pro, and I don't want to bring all that garbage with. I gotta start from the bottom. So yes, someone was kind enough to provide me with a true Jedi lightsaber, but I did not bring it with me. And I got it in space gray, if you're wondering. That was your next question. Yes. Yes, sir.
So, how involved were you personally with the translations and textual criticism of NIV?
The only direct connection I've had is I've worked as a critical consultant with the Lockman Foundation on the 95 NASB. I haven't had anything to do with the new, well, I'm not even sure if I'm supposed to say this, but there's going to be a new NASB next year. But I've had nothing to do with that, unfortunately. I would like to have, not that I would have had time to. Nothing really directly. I mean, I know a number of the translators and things like that, but a lot of folks involved in that kind of stuff are scared of apologists. I scare people. I'm not really sure why. My granddaughter thinks I'm great, but for some reason, if you debate in mosques, and if you have about 47,000 videos on YouTube from black Hebrew Israelites with you in flames with a pitchfork and horns, for some reason they just find that they don't necessarily want to be associated with someone like that. And I would love to have more involvement in some of those types of things, but I see my role far more out on the frontier, sort of, the bleeding edge of apologetics, than in the rear guard sort of type thing. Yes, ma'am. Uh-huh.
And this could be partly because of my institution. The only other form that I ever studied was Spanish, which sometimes the infrastructure was lost from the wood. So my question was just whenever you were talking about how this would be could have said apart
from God?
You know, 5 years stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Could that be in reference to like through the death?
Yeah, the only way that you could really understand Chorus Theou would be that he died abandoned by God.
So that's why I was trying to figure out what it could be referencing something different. Some people could think that is contradictory to the other version, but if it's talking about the death, specifically only, not
yeah, you could barely make sense of it. The problem is, from my perspective, it would be why throw this in there and then never explain it? I mean, by the grace of God, you know, the union of the elect with what Hebrews is going to go on and talk about is these brethren are those who God has chosen and placed in Christ, and it really an overarching theology. It's the elect who've been united with Christ. If there was something about abandonment or something like that, it's never picked up anywhere else in Hebrews, and in fact it's really contradictory because the Son is doing exactly what the Father's intention and will for him in the first place was. So it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, but that would be the only way I could interpret it. I don't think it has really any standing as being able to be seen as original, but obviously it was a reading that existed in the ancient church, and so we make note of it and go from there. Yes, sir.
How do larger portions of text like the Pericope and Oprah make it into modern translations?
Well, I should note, and we only have a moment or two, there are only two major text portions that are variants: the Pericope Adulterae, John 7:53 through 8:11, and the longer ending of Mark 16:9 through 20. Those are the big boys. Once you know about them, there isn't anything else. There are single verses. Almost all the single verses are parallels. So for example, you'll have a verse in Matthew that actually comes from Luke, and a lot of scribes felt that there needed to be harmony between the Gospels, and so they would harmonize stuff when there was a difference between Matthew and Luke. Or it might have just been an inadvertent addition because they had memorized it in one and it wasn't in the other, but when they were copying it, it just came out the way they had memorized it. But there are only two, and the evidence for the longer ending of Mark is significantly stronger than the ending for the Pericope Adulterae. There's much earlier evidence for the longer ending of Mark. The reason I still don't believe that it is original is because there are multiple endings to Mark. And if the longer ending was original to Mark, there wouldn't have been a reason for all these other endings to arise if it had always been there. The fact is that people sensed that there needed to be something more in Mark. And so you have a medium, and you have a combination of a medium and a short, and so on and so forth. And that to me is the greatest evidence of the non-originality of verses 9 through 20. But as to the Pericope Adulterae, as Dan Wallace says, it's his favorite story that's not actually in the Bible. Everybody loves the story. It very clearly was a very favorite story early on. And it eventually found a place. But here's going to be the big thing, and we'll finish with this, and we'll take more questions tomorrow. We'll have plenty of time for questions tomorrow too. But here's the big thing. One takeaway: make sure that if you've been zoning out, the coffee's worn off and everything else. Here's where I will demand. This is where the rubber meets the road for me. This, I think, is just really a non-negotiable. Given my doctrine of Scripture, what I want to know is what was written by the apostles, or in the case of someone like Luke, the initial followers of the apostles. I want to know what they wrote, not what a scribe 500 or 1,000 years later thought they should have written. Because the biblical doctrine of inspiration is not that authors are inspired. What did Paul say? What is inspired? All Scripture is theopneustos. It's Scripture that's God-breathed, not the authors. God-breathed is the very breath of God. And so while the authors, how does Peter put it? Men spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. Okay, that's another description of this process. Well, I want to know what they spoke from God at that time. I want to know what was theopneustos. I want to know when Paul dictated, and Paul did dictate the letter to the Romans, by the way, when his amanuensis finished writing that letter, I want to know what that letter said, not what a church council 300 or 500 years later thought it should have said. And the fact is, the New Testament manuscript tradition is more than sufficient to tell us those things. That to me is the issue, is we want to know what was originally written. You would think that would be not an overly debatable point. It is from two sides. You've got the hyper-skeptics who say, we can never find out, we can't know, like a Bart Ehrman. Well, he says that in some contexts, in other contexts he doesn't. Other contexts saying, we're just playing games, we already know. That's that side. But then on the other side, for various theological reasons, you have people saying, no, to do that requires you to engage in too much worldly reasoning. Instead, we're going to use this theological paradigm to determine these things. And then there's various groups that fall under that rubric. And I say, these folks here can never defend their position in the mosque, can never defend their position against Bart Ehrman. And hence, it's really the end of Christian apologetics. And that's why I'm concerned when I see people embracing those perspectives. That's really a concern to me. Okay? All right, thank you very, very much for being here this evening. What time do we get started?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. If you're here, then you are truly weird. But I'll be here, and so we'll see how many of you are. Thanks for coming this evening. God bless.